welcome again. The previous talk concerned the world as it is in relation to the principles of natural law, which actually govern what happens, and the moral standing of those entrusted with vital roles in the administration of society. It finished with a call to the police, the judiciary, and the people to reconsider their attitudes to their moral responsibilities regarding governance. It's time to expand that grouping to include the military and to explain in more detail how the principles of true morality prevent the establishment of a stable global dictatorship or one world government. In the comments box is the link to the Oath of Allegiance, sworn or affirmed by all members of the Australian Defence Forces. Note that two forces are designated as royal, the exception being the Army, and the oath is sworn to the monarch or their heirs and successors according to law. That is significant because according to constitutional law, remember, we're not talking legislation here, the monarch may not necessarily be a familial descendant of the former monarch. If no one willing to adhere to the coronation oath to uphold the laws and customs of the peoples of the Commonwealth can be found within the existing royal family, it is not only permissible but imperative that a suitable alternative be found elsewhere. There are plenty of precedents for a member of a foreign monarchy to become monarch of England, as did the Plantagenets of France, the Stuarts of Scotland, and the Hanoverians of Germany, from which the Windsors are descended. Their name was changed to Windsor from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha during the First World War, when it was felt that having a royal family bearing a name derived from the enemy hierarchy wouldn't be the best look. An important portion of that oath states that the swearer will resist the enemies of the monarch and faithfully discharge their duties according to law, which, as we are all now aware, is not the same as legislation. It is the Constitution which is referred to here. The Defence Forces are therefore under the same obligation to resist unlawful orders and protect the rights of loyal Crown subjects as are the police, since anyone unlawfully oppressing subjects must, by definition, be an enemy of the office of the Crown, even if that office be vacant from time to time. The same admonition, therefore, applies to the military as it does to the police. They have been entrusted with the weaponry and mechanisms to protect the subjects, and they must answer the question, are you doing that, soldier, sailor, or airman, if you stand down while criminals usurp the Crown's role and unlawfully browbeat and oppress loyal Crown subjects? You have not sworn to serve the government, but the office of the monarch and the subjects who the monarch has sworn to protect. When are you going to do your job? The point that almost everyone is missing in this sorry scenario is the question of morality and the reality of karmic accountability. The universe runs on immutable natural laws, which no one has the power to alter or negate. One of those laws, which extends into the physical realm of human existence, is that peaceful coexistence between us is only possible if everyone agrees to abide by the moral principles of non-aggression against others. Because there will always be some who choose not to abide by these principles and commit offences against the person or property of others, the goal of perfect peace remains an ideal. However, we each have a responsibility to strive toward that ideal, which we do in two main ways. First, we refrain from breaking the common law tenets of not doing harm, not causing loss, not committing fraud, and keeping the peace on our own account. We take personal responsibility for that. Second, when we see these things being done by someone else, no matter who that individual or people may be, we speak out against it and do whatever we can to stop it. The more people who do these two things, the more peaceful and prosperous a community will become. Now, when we look around at our world, and especially our own communities and nations, do we see a peaceful, prosperous world? In some measures, yes, we enjoy great degrees of prosperity compared with almost any other communities that have ever existed. But is that situation improving or deteriorating? Is it becoming easier or more difficult for people to maintain their standard of living, or for the next generation to enjoy the same access to some of the needs displayed on even the lower levels of Maslow's famous pyramid of needs? The answer is clearly that during the last 3 years in particular, many people have lost access to much of the things listed on that pyramid, and for some, far too high a number, to almost all of those essentials for a fulfilling life. This is symptomatic of a terrible breakdown, not of morality, for morality is impervious to human greed or denial. It exists in full force, whether we acknowledge it or not, but a breakdown of people's adherence to the concept that morality is necessary for a fulfilling life. Those we have entrusted with the administration of our communities have abused their positions of authority to assume illegitimate power and domination over those they have sworn to serve, even to enrich themselves in the process. And what is the source of that enrichment? It is the honest toil of decent people who are prepared, unlike these leeches, to work for what they want, instead of insinuating themselves into power and defrauding and bullying those decent ones out of the fruits of their labours. One can understand the reluctance of the perpetrators of these crimes to call a halt to them. They are, after all, amassing huge personal fortunes. What is harder to understand is the craven bowing and scraping of an allegedly educated population to this wholesale chicanery of a self-aggrandising ruling elite. To the population of Australia, it's necessary to issue the admonition as well. It's no good looking around for someone else to blame. We've fallen short of our moral obligation to recognise evil when it confronts us, and to not only speak out against it, but to also act. We need to ask ourselves some hard questions, like the ones I've proposed to those in uniform. Why have we personally allowed these crimes against us and our children to go unpunished? Is it because we are afraid of retribution or reprisal, or loss of some of the shiny trinkets we've been programmed to value? Appeasement will not cause the oppression to stop. Sooner or later, it has to be stood up to. Is it because we are distracted by the theatre of Parliament, the constant lure of existentially irrelevant sporting contests, the sapping power of addictions to drugs, sex, and transient pleasures like holidaying and other forms of entertainment laid on as if water from a tap? The planning of the criminals seeking their global dominance continues, whether we ignore it or not. Are we to wait until the door to our prison is slammed shut before we awake and protest? It will be far harder then to turn back the tide. Many times in history, despots have sought to establish control over the whole world, or as much of it as they knew. All failed. Why was that? There are a few reasons. One is the fact that subduing by force is immoral and violates an immutable law. Resistance is inevitable because not everyone will simply lie down and say, "Have your way with me, but please be gentle." King John discovered that people will not always stand for brutal force as a means of administration. Our constitution went from spoken to formalised in one sealed document that stands as irrefutable evidence of the set of standards that draws the line between legitimate and criminal governance. The flaw in such attempts is recognised by the current plotters, so they decided that people had to be deceived into submission. Their perverted view of karma is that if people can be persuaded to permit dominance over themselves, even if it be by trickery, that this somehow ameliorates the karmic debt they might otherwise accrue. It's based on an old Roman law maxim: let him who would be deceived be deceived. In other words, if people aren't attentive enough to their own interests to notice when they are being screwed over, it's their own fault. Ask yourselves the question, am I one of those people? Do I deserve what's happening to me in my life? On one level, the answer is no, because another is trying to rob you of your time, property, and rights. On another level, however, if you refuse to perceive the threat even when warned, and then also refuse to defend yourself, does that not warrant some recrimination? Do you still insist that you bear no responsibility? There is such a thing as intellectual honesty, and now is a time when ignoring the need for it constitutes moral delinquency, irrespective of what others may be doing. Now that the fraud is being slowly exposed, it remains to be seen whether we achieve a Ceausescu moment or a knee-jerk reaction of ramped-up violence motivated by desperation. Even if the latter, we can derive cold comfort from the fact that attempts at empire building always eventually collapse, because all spare resources are spent maintaining the periphery. There are always points where weakness is perceived and resistance gains traction. The fact that the supposedly omnipotent Romans were unable to subdue Scotland and resorted to a defensive wall is stark evidence of that principle. A further inescapable problem is that there is no honour among thieves, and these people trying to subdue us are nothing if not that. Assuming they succeed for a time, they are moral cannibals and will eventually set about devouring each other in a series of Stalinist or Hitlerite purges of those who can't be trusted. We've seen it dozens of times in gangster movies, haven't we? Eventually, a cult of personality develops, whereby those who still refuse to think for themselves will believe every word that proceeds out of the mouth of their chosen saviour of the moment. This has always been the pattern, and it exists because the general population refuses to accept moral responsibility for their situation. It's easier to blame someone else, even at the price of the freedom of one's children, all too often sacrificed in needless wars or bloody protests which could have been peaceful if embarked upon sooner. Although these attempts are always doomed to failure, society's refusal to properly engage in resistance enables a far greater degree of damage and suffering than might be the case. People seem always to choose to suffer until they don't, and will try every failed remedy until they finally accept the one that would have worked all along. We have been bequeathed a wonderful constitution which recognises our innate freedom to live peacefully, a freedom which is safeguarded by the trial by jury process, whereby the government always remains under the control of the people, and which can even prevent unlawful military conscription. There is no need to have to choose between foreign or domestically imposed servitude. This is an eternal struggle, not between false dichotomies of left or right, colour or creed, etc., but between good and evil. As Professor Jordan Peterson says, that line runs not between groups of people, but through the hearts of every one of us. Choose wisely, people. This will be the last video for some weeks, as my excellent producer Tony Lambert is going on a well-earned holiday, and I don't wish to produce anything of a lower standard than we've so far achieved. However, the weekly Zoom meetings will continue, and anyone wishing to attend can email their details to the address shown on all the videos. Thank you for watching.